So as some of you might have heard, it looks like we are on track to getting a Devil Wears Prada sequel. This announcement has been met with immediate criticism, understandably so, because it is a broad consensus that Hollywood has not always had the greatest track record of producing the best sequels, and they are usually done in excess and unnecessarily. This movie in particular has struck a chord with the larger population, as it represents a previously unexplored perspective on the world of fashion and perfectly portrays the industry in a way which resonates with even those who are uninterested or have no knowledge of fashion. You need not know what sort of Calvin Klein skirts are required for a photo shoot, or the impact of Oscar de la Renta's line of cerulean military jackets, to grasp the difficulty and exhaustion of working for an overbearing boss who demands nothing short of perfection. And before you know it, you yourself have become the very thing you resented. In a manner of speaking. Films about fashion, I would say, are rare. This industry being taken seriously has always been a road paved with strife, as even the devil herself acknowledged, when met with the protagonist's blatant disregard of its importance. It is comical that a multi-billion-dollar industry, which represents countless jobs, is so often overlooked and renowned for its superficiality when neither the arts nor sports were meant to exist to cure cancer. And yet, patrons of such industries have reinforced their significance and worthiness. The amount of movies created about artists and athletes are vast, honoring their legacy and delving into the lasting influence they have left behind, not only to the industry, but to the world at large. But the same cannot be said of films about fashion designers, let alone serious films about fashion. Which is why the very existence of The Devil Wears Prada is seen as groundbreaking and is still relevant to this day. So would a sequel mean the absolute demise and ruin of a beloved original? It most probably would, at least according to a vast majority of the internet, and more importantly, what past experience has shown us. Most Hollywood sequels and remakes are, for lack of a better word, abysmal. And similar to the current circumstances, absolutely not something anyone had asked for. In 99% of cases, we witnessed beloved franchises crash and burn, milked for cash, and then eventually fall into oblivion. If we're lucky, because in some instances, a franchise would be revived like a dead corpse and forced into life support until it withers into a vegetable. Most of us can readily point out what the issue with these sequels and remakes are: the lack of sincerity behind these producers' intentions, or genuine understanding of what was depicted in the originals and what they represented. At best, we get vapid portrayals of characters which vaguely resemble their counterparts in the original, but do not come nearly close enough to being as memorable. Franchises like the Star Wars sequels and Rings of Power are great examples. At worst, we get idiosyncratic storylines which completely defies the beating heart of the original and renders its core substance utterly meaningless, such as quite literally any of the Disney remakes. We know the problem behind this. We know that Hollywood has an itching tendency to rely solely on nostalgia and make superficial attempts to overcorrect their past mistakes and overcompensate antiquated ideologies they themselves have perpetuated in these originals. That is, in a nutshell, what makes sequels and remakes so abhorred in this century. Its disingenuous nature and the pathetic aim to please an audience these producers cannot even begin to relate to. It is largely known that this is what creates an abysmal sequel. But what makes a sequel good? Contrary to what you may expect, I am not actually here to scrutinize how a Devil Wears Prada sequel would be a bad idea, and a bad investment for that matter. That has been done extensively by many, as soon as the announcement was released. I am, in fact, here to play devil's advocate. As in, if we were to accept our fate that a sequel is inevitable, so it may seem, the question would be, how does one make an acceptable or even satisfying sequel? More specifically, what would make a Devil Wears Prada sequel not so abysmal? People love to criticize a bad sequel or remake, myself included, and in the event of a foreseeable remake announcement, the hate bandwagon immediately begins to churn. The negative reception is not our fault as the audience. Their oversaturation has obliterated our confidence in sequels, and makes us forget that amidst the 99% of abhorrent sequels, there exists the 1% which do stand out. And their existence itself is almost as rare as movies about fashion. This, of course, is exclusionary of second and third movies, which have been pre-planned as a trilogy or franchise, like Lord of the Rings or the original Star Wars trilogy, episodes 4 to 6. So my intention here is to explore these successful sequels or remakes and open a discussion on what we can take from them and implement into The Devil Wears Prada 2. And also look at some unsuccessful examples to see what could be learned from them. Just a couple of disclaimers. I am aware that what I am about to propose would be subject to dissent and scrutiny, but this is simply one woman's opinion. So please be kind. The second thing is that I am basing my argument on the consensus that these sequels are superior to the original. There is some debate and obviously preference as to which is better, but the mere fact that the sequel has to be at least as good as the original to generate such debate shows that there is some solid takeaway here. Furthermore, there will be spoilers regarding these movies I am about to discuss, so I will be putting some disclaimer stamps along the way. Probably one of the most renowned sequels of all time would be The Godfather Part 2. It is widely agreed that the second Godfather 2 is superior to the first. First and foremost, something I would like to point out in relation to The Devil Wears Prada is that, similar to Andrea Sachs, Michael Corleone's character arc is more or less complete by the end of the first film. The story arc in Godfather is also very much complete and can be seen as a standalone film. So the argument that a movie should be left alone because the arc of the main protagonist and story has ended, in my opinion, is weak. The first Godfather is about the son of a formidable Don in 1940s New York and his rise to power as his father's successor, despite his initial assertion of carving a separate identity to his mafia family and rejection of their morals, only to find himself succumbed by their twisted values and gradually descending into corruption. So what we have here is a classic tale of a morally upstanding protagonist turning over to the dark side, a trope we have seen in many other films. Godfather 2 takes us to a whole new level in relation to the characters. While the first Godfather adheres to a narrative-oriented story which focuses on the grave consequences of a business deal gone wrong, thereby forever changing the main character's ideology, Godfather 2 hones in on the lasting impact it has not only on the main character, but also his father, Vito Corleone, who had a similar rise to power and eventual downfall. It ingeniously shows us the contrast between Vito's rise and Michael's fall. This makes Godfather 2 a film about deeper character study, raising philosophical touchstones which were not explored in the first film. Put simply, what makes the second film a brilliant sequel is that it adds depth to the world and characters created in the first film. The reason I bring this up is because Andrea Sachs has a comparable character arc to Michael Corleone in the first Godfather. Andy begins her career with a negative mindset towards the world of fashion, just as Michael rejects the world of crime and wanted no part in it. Yet as the story progresses, an inciting incident causes a shift in the protagonist's view. In The Devil Wears Prada, upon failing to meet her boss's expectations and being brutally reprimanded, Andy realizes the necessity of taking a genuine interest in her work in order to succeed in the workplace and get ahead in her career. In The Godfather, a plot to murder his father triggers Michael's return to the family and incentivizes him to engage in the family business as a means to protect his family. This is the point in which these characters begin to see value in the very thing they once resented. Now, I am by no means saying The Devil Wears Prada is on par with the level of writing in The Godfather. The Godfather is an unimpeachable masterpiece, but I will say The Devil Wears Prada is a masterpiece in its own right. They are both iconic in their respective genres. I simply think there is a point of comparison between the two main characters' arcs. The only difference is, Andy in the end chooses to walk away from the life Miranda Priestley offers, yet Michael chooses to embrace the life of crime Vito Corleone left him. And this juxtaposition in their decision-making is a crucial point in their respective character arcs. The tone at the end of The Devil Wears Prada is somewhat positive as we see Andy chooses her own morals over a road of hardship and sacrifice she does not wish to compromise for. Whereas in The Godfather, there is an undertone of lingering melancholy in the ending, where the audience knows that the price Michael pays for his decision would be one of severity. So why is this important, since these two characters' endings deviate in such a way? First of all, it should be pointed out that Anne Hathaway not returning for The Devil Wears Prada 2 should not hinder the story arc in the sequel. Her character's choice in the ending of the first film is the very reason she would not serve to be in the second film, because she walked away from the fashion industry. On the other hand, it was imperative that Al Pacino return for The Godfather 2, because it would make sense to create a deeper, more severe character arc for him following his first arc, given that he chose the mafia life. Godfather 2 meticulously details the sacrifice he makes to live this life, a life which mirrors that of his own father, and a life which, I dare say, mirrors that of Miranda Priestley. Because like Michael and Vito, Miranda too made a decision earlier in her youth to head towards a road of sacrifice and hardship, as she puts it to Andy when we find out that she was willing to push Nigel under the bus to maintain her position. It evidently is not the exact same sacrifice and hardship as one would have running a New York mafia, but it is a severe compromise one would make being the head of a world-renowned fashion publication in New York. Being loathed and ridiculed by the public, making enemies left, right, and center, the fear of being brought down and replaced, having your partner walk out on you, struggling through a complicated relationship with your children, and losing loved ones. Sacrifices we see both Michael and Miranda have made to be in their positions. The top of the pyramid is a lonely and cold place to be. Now granted, Michael made his choice based on a selfless act to protect his family, whereas Miranda may have made her choice based on, one would say, selfish reasons to further her own career. Although one may argue that it was implied she did what she did as a means of preventing the magazine from suffering under someone else's reign.
Any of the other choices would have found that job impossible and the magazine would have suffered.
But regardless, they both paid a heavy price for their choices. And this brings me to what I think the Devil Wears Prada sequel should be about. Miranda. We have caught glimpses of her vulnerability in the first movie, so it would be interesting to see further development of her character through intricacies of her strife being in her position, as we have seen that of Michael's in Godfather Part 2. The rough outline has been announced for the sequel's premise, where Miranda, in the face of Runway's decline, turns to Emily, who now is the executive head of an LVMH-esque luxury fashion conglomerate, for help. Contrary to certain commentators like Modern Girls who criticize this premise for being a superficial story of vengeance and comeuppance, I actually think it is a solid foundation in building a complex story about one's rise to the top and eventual downfall, the way it was depicted in Godfather Part 2. It can further push forward the realities of an ever-changing industry and show us how if one does not evolve with it, one may very well be digging their own grave. But the main focus should be on the characters, specifically about these characters in a particular stage in their career and the psychological struggle in their endeavors. The first movie has set up Miranda to be a formidable player in the industry, at the very top of the food chain where her word is law.
You still don't get it, do you? Her opinion is the only one that matters.
However, her vehement need to grasp onto power, as we have seen in the end of the first film, can very much set in stone the path to her downfall. While I acknowledge that Miranda is undeniably someone who deserves to be in such a position of power, given her unwavering expertise in fashion, intellectual prowess, and business acumen as clearly portrayed in the movie, this does not shield one from the consequences of being ruthless and unforgiving, however justified her reasons may be. And this effect can be characterized in both Emily and Nigel, who are set to be in the sequel. As we have seen in The Devil Wears Prada, Andy chose to step over Emily the same way Miranda stepped over Nigel in order to get ahead, which is what cemented Andy's arc, where she found herself becoming the devil. But what we did not see is the lasting impact these actions have left on their victims, something which could be explored in the sequel. And this could serve as a crucial effect on Miranda's own character arc, as seeing that the roles of power are about to be reversed between Miranda and Emily. Emily's experience from Andy's betrayal, as well as years of Miranda's ill treatment, would serve as what shapes her own philosophy in her career venture. I also think it would be effective to mirror this to flashbacks of a young Miranda climbing the career ladder, and the sacrifices she had made, which shaped her to be the person she is today, depicted similarly in a young Vito Corleone in The Godfather 2. Although a potential issue this storyline may run into is the lack of a foil, as depicted between Andy and Miranda, who are juxtapositions of each other and henceforth creates their character conflict. But it could be rectified through portraying a contrast between Emily and Miranda as bosses in their respective positions. I think this depiction is important, because not only does it show Emily as a distinct person of her own, despite having gone down a similar path as Miranda, her own philosophy and the decisions she makes should be reflective of the experience she had with Miranda and Andy. We have seen enough of Emily's feisty personality in the first film.
Oh, I'm sorry, do you have some prior commitment? some hideous skirt convention you have to go to.
As we have seen in Miranda, and of how she views or viewed the world. Miranda and Andy both represent something crucial in her career. Miranda being no doubt someone she looks up to, greatly respects, yet fears, and an embodiment of everything Emily aspires to be. Andy's impact on Emily, on the other hand, is somewhat tricky to pinpoint, because her feelings towards Andy have always been between lukewarm, animosity, and resentment. She resents Andy for having surpassed her and cast her down despite a lack of passion in the very thing she has worked for her whole life. Yet the ending implies a newfound respect she emanates towards Andy.
You have some very large shoes to fill.
Which leads me to think that she is a fair person who recognizes game when it is deserved, given that Andy has worked hard to earn her place in Paris, however sore a spot it has left for Emily. And I would like to believe she respects Andy even more for choosing her own path in the end. After all, if the roles were reversed between Emily and Andy, who is to say she would not have done the same thing Andy did to her in order to get ahead? Emily is absolutely someone who would put herself first at all costs. Her character and drive is probably what leads her to becoming the head of a luxury fashion conglomerate. One could say she is a product of Miranda's creation, after having suffered through years of workplace torment and abuse, yet comes out the other end a force to be reckoned with in the industry, and someone who strives for and achieves perfection, just as Miranda does. So this conflict we are about to see between her and Miranda would be fascinating. There's this channel called Savage Books who made an interesting video comparing The Devil Wears Prada to Whiplash. Now for those of you who have not seen Whiplash, there is a similar dynamic between a student who strives for greatness and a teacher who profusely demands for perfection. Obviously, this dynamic is seen between Andy and Miranda, but I would argue that it is something that should be more evident between Emily and Miranda, given that Emily is someone who wants to be great in the field of fashion, whereas Andy simply wants to be great enough in her stepping stone for her dream job as a journalist. The reason I raise this comparison is because in Whiplash, the protagonist actively puts himself under extreme lengths to vie for his teacher's approval, something Andy, and more apparently Emily, have done to gain Miranda's favor. It goes without saying that this job is one of utmost importance, more so for Emily than it is for Andy, as she has centered her entire life around fashion the same way in Whiplash. Andrew Neiman has centered his entire life around becoming the greatest jazz drummer of all time. And just like Miranda, Terrence Fletcher, the antagonist in Whiplash, instills fear and inflicts psychological pain on his students by torturously pushing them to their breaking point. He intentionally puts Neiman in under extreme pressure, and no cost is too great to produce what he deems as greatness. We know in Whiplash that it completely crushes Neiman's soul and brings him to his breaking point after having thrown out of the jazz band, effectively ending his career and dreams. And he takes revenge on Fletcher by reporting his abuse and having him fired from Schaefer Conservatory, only for Fletcher to pull a 180 on Neiman, inviting him to play for his band in a jazz festival under the pretense of a truce, but really to humiliate him by switching to a song unknown to Neiman. Yet Neiman persists and proves to Fletcher how far he has come in his pursuit of greatness, and finally earning his teacher's stamp of approval. After all the torment Neiman went through under Fletcher's thumb, he still yearns for Fletcher's approval. My point in all this is that abusive dynamics as such are entrenched in a victim's psyche. If you have ever been in a similar dynamic, where you are the receiver of psychological abuse, you know it never truly leaves you, even when the position of power is reversed. The ending of Whiplash is left with a conflicting tone, because as much as you applaud Neiman's accomplishment, you as the audience are supposed to question whether the glory is worth all the pain and torture. Now we know in the ending of The Devil Wears Prada, Andy decides that it is not, but Emily clearly does, as evident of her staying in her job, even after being literally hit by a car whilst carrying out a task for Miranda, and Miranda so openly favoring a colleague over her. Which leads me to think that even when a shift in power dynamic occurs between Emily and Miranda, I'm not sure it is going to be a story of glorious revenge as some may suspect it to be. It is possible, and I myself would like to see Emily standing up to Miranda in her newfound position of power. But the motivations behind her actions would not be one of petty vengeance, but a persistent need to gain Miranda's respect and approval, even after all she had endured for Miranda, and especially having seen Miranda's respect for Andy. This, I believe, would make an enthralling dynamic to watch. Now, I am by no means saying that Miranda should still have the upper hand in the sequel. Miranda's vulnerability should still be the focal point, but Emily's vulnerability would make an interesting foil. That after all these years, Emily remains subject to Miranda's influence, an experience which resonates with so many of us. But what would be Miranda's main weakness? I think it would be her refusal to let go of control, even in the face of a declining industry she is in, and thus her power slowly slipping away from her. Miranda is a textbook perfectionist, as established in the first film. There is likely no other person who can come close to being as good at their job as she is. But as we all know, being great comes at a severe cost, as evident through the dissolution of her marriages and her lack of time and care given to her children, which I would like to see more of in the sequel, specifically how her relationship with her children is impacted.
They played Rachmaninoff. Everyone loved it. Everyone except me, because sadly I was not there.
We see how she throws herself into work amidst her personal life erupting into flames. She clings onto it because it's all she has left, the very essence of her identity. I think it would make an effective character arc to see her lose the one thing which holds her together. As we so often see in characters who desperately hold on to control, the incessant need to hold on to it is what makes them lose it. And after having lost everything, they learn to rebuild a newfound healthier sense of self. Miranda has always been a bit of an enigma to the audience, and this mystique partially shields her from criticism and even justifies her abusive treatment of others and way of conducting business. But to establish depth in a character is to strip them of their core agency, in this case, Miranda's job and position of power. And when we peel back the layers of Miranda, we may very well find that underneath this facade, she is vulnerable like the rest of us. Having been in her position of influence for so long, passing on the torch would be inevitable, especially in the face of changing times and new demands. So I think this is something worth exploring. And it also says something about women being in high positions and the tribulations they face. We as women endeavor to do it all, but the reality is that painful sacrifices are usually made in pursuit of an extraordinary career. We can also relate to our sense of worth being directly tied to our career accomplishments, rather than who we really are as people. It explains the terror for those who go through a midlife crisis when they realize their inability to recognize who they are besides their job and achievements. The story of a character being stripped of her agency is seen even in real life. A great example would be Steve Jobs, who is infamous for being controlling and borderline abusive in the workplace, all in the endeavor of creating some of the most influential and era-defining tech products the world has ever seen. This premise of his need for control is even highlighted in the 2015 biopic, Steve Jobs, which makes up the central theme of the movie, where his controlling behavior isolates everyone around him.
And then I'm gonna say the voice demo that didn't work was designed by Andy Hertzfeld. So unless you want to be disgraced in front of your friends, family, colleagues, stockholders, and the press, I wouldn't stand here arguing. I'd go try and get some more bullets out of the gun. Do it, Andy!
Including his own daughter.
That's why I'm not impressed with your story, Dad. It's that you knew what I was going through and you didn't do anything about it, and that makes you an unconscionable coward.
And leads to a falling out with Apple CEO.
You're insubordinate, you make people miserable. Our top engineers are fleeing to Sun, Dell, HP. Wall Street doesn't know who's driving the bus. We've lost hundreds of millions in value, and I'm the CEO of Apple, Steve. That's my resume.
Who famously ousts him from the company he himself founded and fought for. The loss of the one thing which defines him becomes a sort of spiritual awakening for him. As we all know, he left the industry for years in search of his sense of self before returning with Pixar and eventually regains control of Apple. I see his real-life arc applicable to Miranda as a character, as both are influential and a force to be reckoned with. And more importantly, both their controlling natures isolate those close to them and develops complicated working and personal relationships by drawing comparisons to real-life figures, as we have seen in The Devil Wears Prada, where the world of fashion is very much grounded in our current reality, with references to synonymous real-life figures like Anna Wintour, who Miranda Priestley is based off of. I really hope the writers would not shy away from raising the stakes for Miranda. Even Anna Wintour herself has struggled through precarious periods in her career. She has failed to revive a dying Condé Nast publication like House and Garden.
Winter changed the title to HG. Out were photos of empty rooms. In were lavish spreads of celebrities in their homes. Readers revolted, and the magazine was forced to hand out subscription refunds.
And has been criticized for losing her touch and being stale and predictable in her publications, especially after the '08 recession. She has famously said that being fired builds character. Now, I'm not saying that Miranda has to lose her job in the sequel for a climactic bouncing back arc, but it would be effective for her to go through some form of an epiphany, perhaps a realization that all great things must come to an end, and this is an inevitability that even she cannot have control over. Speaking of being grounded in reality, this brings me to my next point in regards to expanding upon the existent world of fashion set out in The Devil Wears Prada. The issue a lot of bad remakes have relates to contradicting the lore of the world created in the first movie. This is recently seen in the Lord of the Rings prequel series, Rings of Power, taking place 5,000 years before the Fellowship of the Ring, where characters we were introduced to from the original, like Galadriel and Elrond, do not act according to their known characterizations. For instance, it is known from Tolkien's writings that Galadriel married Celeborn in the First Age, whom she had an immensely strong bond with, and gave birth to her daughter Celebrian in the Second Age. Yet this was not shown to be the slightest bit of problem when she got sent off by Gil-galad to leave Middle-earth and return across the sea to Tol Eressëa. Not to mention the peculiar suggestive relationship between Elrond and Galadriel, when we know from Lord of the Rings that Elrond becomes Galadriel's son-in-law, having married her daughter. If you are an avid fan of Lord of the Rings and have seen the Rings of Power, you know this is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of inconsistency and bad writing. So I have no argument against fans of The Devil Wears Prada who would seethe in agony to see the world created in the original crumble in the sequel, which, let's be honest, is a huge possibility. This begins with the problem of writers attempting to overcorrect their original characters to the point until these characters become unrecognizable. And we see this especially with female characters where writers try to make them invincible because it is apparently the easiest way to make them look strong. When ironically, some of the strongest characterization, male or female, comes from their inherent flaws. Hollywood in this era has an issue of cowering from making their female characters flawed and nuanced. Galadriel's characterization in Rings of Power was criticized for this reason, as similarly seen with Rey from the Star Wars sequels. But my point is, every single detail contributes to the world building, so the writers will have to be especially cautious when expanding upon those building blocks. And this is how I think they should do it. By developing the existent world created in the original to reflect appropriate and realistic evolution in accordance with the amount of time which has passed. What do I mean by this? We know that the world in The Devil Wears Prada is loosely an alternative reality to our own. Designers like Calvin Klein, Karl Lagerfeld, and Yves Saint Laurent are often mentioned.
I need 10 or 15 skirts from Calvin Klein. And then I think it was Yves Saint Laurent, wasn't it, who showed cerulean military jackets?
And Miranda missed Lagerfeld just before he boarded a 17-hour flight to Australia.
Miranda is even based off of a powerful real-life figure in fashion, so the existing world in the sequel has to be somewhat aligned to our current world. Specifically, what fashion and fashion journalism looks like at this moment in time. Change is especially important, because there has to be something new offered to the world previously created in order to keep an audience engaged or make them buy into this new world. And it has to be realistic and believable. Otherwise, it would simply be seen as a parody of the original. Which is why the given plotline of Runway being in decline makes sense to me. How many of us have actually picked up a hard copy magazine from a newsstand in the last decade? Everything has gone digital, and even when some of us may still be subscribed to Vogue digitally, most consumers have turned towards internet platforms and forums for fashion news and reviews. The rise of influencers should be a massive factor in the magazine's debilitation, and for that matter, a huge factor in the surge in popularity of luxury fashion. Hence cementing the reversal of power whereby previously designers rely on powerful journalists like Miranda to thrive, when now fashion journalism relies on luxury fashion conglomerates to survive. Blade Runner 2049 is a perfect example of a sequel which defied expectations and exceeds the original by expanding on the cyberpunk dystopian world established in the first movie. And like Godfather 2, the storyline takes place decades after the original. It was produced years after and not something which was pre-planned, much like this Devil Wears Prada sequel. It is also not based on any pre-existing literature, like Godfather Part 2. I know that there is a second Devil Wears Prada novel, but since the first movie did not really follow the material in the first novel, I don't think it matters that this upcoming movie will disregard the second novel, and I think they should disregard it. Because for one, deviating from the material in the first film was the best decision the writers did in creating depth for both Andy and Miranda. And having read both these books, I can tell you that the second novel is just as bad, and fails to add any depth to the characters or construct a meaningful story. But back to my Blade Runner example, the sequel is infinitely better than the original. And I'm not just referring to the visual aesthetics of the world achieved through advancement in film technology. I'm referring to the writing of the story and characterization. First of all, the relationship between Officer K and his holographic AI girlfriend is so much more natural and believable, as opposed to the relationship between Deckard and Rachel, which has been said to be a bit stale. The second thing is that there is immense added depth to the characters in the sequel. We know that none of them are human, and that is the crux of the story in the Blade Runner movies. The question of whether replicants can experience and emulate emotions as true and real as a human can, and whether they can have free will. In the original Blade Runner, the plot actively plays upon the implication of Deckard being human, and the truth was never revealed in the movie. They leave it up to the audience to arrive at their own conclusions and decide for themselves what being human means. What's so great about the sequel is that the reveal of Officer K not being human when he initially suspected that he was, and potentially the love child of Deckard and Rachel, expands upon this philosophical question and drives home the point that being a replicant should not make him any less human, so long as he experiences real emotions from real human memories and willingly makes decisions according to his wants and needs. We know that in the end, he was able to track down Deckard and Rachel's real love child, who turns out to be the memory designer of replicants and whom Officer K's memory actually belongs to, who tells him that she designs these memories based on the human emotions as experienced by a human when reliving the memory, rather than the occurrence of the events itself. She indirectly answers the question of what it means to be human, to experience memory through feeling, which Officer K does, leading him to believe himself to be human to begin with, because it is the emotions evoked which make the memory feel real. My point is, these references and added depth to philosophical questions raised in the original help construct a world reminiscent of the original that is believable and grounded in reality. You might think a dystopian world in 2049 has nothing to say about our present time, but it actually is very reflective of the present. This is evident by the incentives of Wallace, the new owner of the Tyrell Corporation, who seeks to create replicants as a means of producing enough slave labor for interstellar colonization. He is willing to sacrifice as much humanity for galactic dominance, and there is no price he will not pay to achieve this. But despite his programming of replicants to obey his commands, some develop free will. And what does society have for a replicant with free will? Couple this with the new discovery of female replicants being able to reproduce and give birth, which could potentially be utilized to increase slave numbers, and you create a world reminiscent of our own. Because these decisions are usually made by powerful men at the top, sitting in boardrooms of these corporations, creating the invisible hand, which drives modern slavery and determines our choices. It shows the limited and claustrophobic confines of the dreary social construct we live in, perpetuated by a top-down effect of present-day powerful corporations. So applying this world-building concept to The Devil Wears Prada, what does the sequel have to say about our present time? How does it build upon the philosophical questions proposed in the original regarding career sacrifices and the plight of individuals striving to make it under our current social system? Annie's characterization does an excellent job of showcasing one woman's choice to not be ruled and controlled by this invisible hand. An expansion on the characters who choose to remain in this system will further answer such questions like, how does one win in this system and get to the top? How far should one go to achieve greatness? Is any of it worth it in the end? And is the collective perseverance of playing the game in this system what perpetuates it? In relation to the world itself, earlier I mentioned the surge in influencers changing the relationship between fashion journalism and designers, and paved way for the rise in luxury fashion. What the sequel could further include is the phenomenon of the rise in luxury fashion causing a rise in fast fashion, something Miranda actually alluded to and predicted in her iconic speech to Andy about luxury designers indirectly dictating consumer behavior through a trickle-down effect of luxury fashion trends being replicated across decreasing levels of fashion.
And then it filtered down through the department stores and then trickled on down into some tragic casual corner where you no doubt fished it out of some clearance bin.
I would even suggest that they take this idea further in mirroring a most recent phenomenon of the gradual rejection of luxury fashion. Having peeked behind the curtain amidst numerous scandals, reveals of slave labor use, abysmal working conditions, and unreasonably obscene product markups, as seen in Dior. This contributes to the realism of the world and even foreshadows Emily's future of working in luxury fashion, and the struggles she may face in her position when luxury fashion eventually comes to a point of decline. The fashion of The Devil Wears Prada is almost a character of its own, and this idea should be accentuated in the sequel. Most of us understand the importance of fashion and the severity of fashion in The Devil Wears Prada, but you would be surprised by how often it is disregarded. Sure, it serves as a setting and provides context for the story, but it is more than that. Earlier, I drew parallels between The Devil Wears Prada and Whiplash based on Savage Book's analysis, and he proposed an, in my belief, ill-founded idea that The Devil Wears Prada is not actually about fashion, the same way Whiplash is not actually about jazz. Rather, the psychological torment of living up to a tyrant's expectations. Except, The Devil Wears Prada is about fashion. The fashion is a key part of the world building. Getting Andy to understand the severity and influence of fashion akin to any other multi-billion-dollar industry is what cements Andy's character arc, and thus allows the audience to see it as a true force to be reckoned with. The movie reminds us time and time again, through Nigel and other side characters, of how important a role it plays in this particular world. And I applaud the movie for not hiding the focus of fashion behind a veil in order to attract a wider audience of men who would otherwise be quick to disregard it because of the subject matter. Yet I agree with the wider concern of the fashion in the sequel potentially paling in comparison to the original, as we have seen in many other remakes of once fashionably influential shows, such as Gossip Girl 2021 and the Sex and the City reboot and Just Like That. The irony is that in both these reboots, the original costume designers return to reprise their roles. Eric Damon for Gossip Girl and Patricia Fields for Sex and the City, who is also the costume designer for The Devil Wears Prada. Yet the fashion has been widely criticized to be lackluster, despite their costuming in the original causing waves of trends back in the day. It may have something to do with the difficulty of recapturing the magic and impact the fashion had in the original, just as it is hard to recapture that of the original story. But I believe that the deeper reason lies in the fact that story and fashion are always intrinsically linked. So if the story is lackluster, the fashion will consequentially be lackluster. Simply having the characters wear aesthetically striking clothing does not make the clothes memorable. Rather, it is the characters who make them memorable. In the original Gossip Girl, every single main character has a distinct style of their own, which tells us something about their personalities. Serena van der Woodsen is carefree, open, and experimental, so her bohemian and relaxed sense of style reflects that. Blair Waldorf is traditional, ambitious, and rigid, so her classic old money style goes with her character. If these characters were to start wearing each other's clothing, the clothing itself would not have the same effect, as it would make no sense for them to be wearing these clothes. It is the very reason the fashion in the Gossip Girl reboot lacked the same effect. Contrary to what some may think, it has nothing to do with the costume designer losing touch. It is because the story and characters are badly written and lack distinct and impactful personalities. What does Julian Calloway's street style tell us about her character? That she is a trendy fashion influencer? Why does Audrey Hope have to have a preppy sense of style? It's not as if she's particularly academically driven. Not to mention she is the daughter of a luxury athleisure fashion designer. You might consider these outfits nice to look at, but what's looking nice compared to being compelling? In the original Gossip Girl, Blair is the sole person who can carry this Marchesa gown, because it signifies her regal-like mentality, as reinforced by her strong-willed, strict, and commanding blue blood mother. Blair herself is written to be a compelling character.
Haven't you heard? I'm the crazy bitch around here.
She commands presence and captures our attention.
I'm the best of the best. I'm Blair Waldorf.
Hence, her outfits follow suit. Girls aspire to be like her and thus emulate her through her style. The very same problem is seen in the Sex and the City reboot, despite the characters from the original reprising their own roles. Sex and the City's fashion is something which needs no introduction. It defined the fashion in the 90s and early 2000s and is still highly sought after and emulated till this very day. The four main characters, Carrie Bradshaw, Samantha Jones, Charlotte York, and Miranda Hobbs, all have a distinct sense of style which fit their distinct personalities, making their costuming so memorable. Yet, and Just Like That did not even come close to recapturing that same magic, due to the new show's uninteresting storylines and the characters seeming lost in their previous identities. I don't think it is in particular Patricia Fields' fault, as how does one create costuming for a character who has no distinct identity? She likely ran into a similar issue in Emily in Paris with the poorly written characters and appalling storyline. Emily's costuming is abhorrent because it does not fit her character. The eccentricity, flashiness, and loud colors do not follow her bland and uninteresting personality, nor her position as a marketing executive for that matter, with the constant Chanel they put her in. Now you could say the same thing for Carrie, wearing Fendi purses and owning 400 pairs of Manolos, despite being a mere newspaper columnist. But Sex and the City made it a point to mention Carrie's love of fashion over and over.
Manolo Blahnik, Mary Jane's. I thought these were an urban shoe myth.
And her financial burden as a result of her frivolous spending was even written as a plot point in an episode.
I spent $40,000 on shoes and I have no place to live? I will literally be the old woman who lived in her shoes.
Something the writers in Emily in Paris evidently did not do to explain Emily's wardrobe choices. In a nutshell, it is the difference between a well-written show like Sex and the City and a poorly written show like Emily in Paris, which determines whether the audience would buy into the fashion. Succession, for instance, has caused a great deal of buzz surrounding the fashion. But I doubt the same minimalist outfits would have the same impact if it were not for the excellent writing and fascinating characters. It is the person who wears the clothes, not the clothes who wear the person. Hence, I have full confidence that strong narrative and characters will naturally create strong costuming in the Devil Wears Prada sequel. As seen in the original, every outfit each character wears pragmatically encapsulates their identity. Andy's style evolution began with her outfits being poorly constructed, as she had no interest in or knowledge of fashion. Yet following her recognition and acceptance of fashion, she experimented with different outfits with the help of Nigel, thereby educating herself in fashion, and eventually finds her own sense of style as an indication of finding her own identity. Her gown in The Benefit even subtly mirrors that of Miranda's, as shown in the neckline, when the audience begins to see her turning into Miranda. On the other hand, Emily Charlton's style exudes edgy femininity, synonymous with her fierce personality. There are also subtle details in her outfits, which indicate her attempts in embodying Miranda. Then we have the devil herself, who is the living embodiment of fashion. I like that instead of dressing her like Anna Wintour with her floral printed dresses and signature shades, which would have been a bit too on the nose, her outfits were loosely inspired by the former editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar. I actually think that as opposed to Wintour, her style has a bit more of an edge to it, yet still very timeless, which reflects Miranda's no-nonsense personality and strong sense of security in herself. I would like to see Emily come into her own in terms of her style in the sequel. There are a number of aspects to work with as an indication of her character development. The parts from her past, such as the edginess and slightly alternative look, yet perhaps more polished and refined, being more secure at the top of the career ladder. I'm no stylist, so I may be wrong, but I see her wearing a bit more crimson red as a signifier of her newfound ruthlessness and out-for-blood approach to business. I can very much see Emily Blunt pulling it off. Miranda's style would probably not change much, as she has always been secure in her position and knew what she wanted, but I think some subtle changes would reflect her evolution, such as the edginess being more toned down amidst her vulnerable moments, which can be done with a bit less accessorizing. The minimal look would also align with our current era of favoring minimalism and subtlety. I also have this idea of her signature silver white hair turning ever so slightly gray, as a metaphor of her fading away from the scene. But the point is, this will be of the discretion of the costume designers based on the material they are given. Whether it works will depend on the effectiveness of the story. So all in all, I believe the three aspects which would make the sequel work would be added depth to the story and characters, consistent expansion on the world building, and creating fashion which follows the story. The tragedy is that, given Hollywood's propensity to put money first, there is likely going to be a great deal of inappropriate pandering, which would result in disrupting appropriate character development and story progression. If that happens, we may revisit this video when it ages like milk. But I do wish to give the producers and writers the benefit of the doubt. They did have a hand in adapting an otherwise mediocre story into something phenomenal. And if Meryl Streep would have anything to do with consulting the script the way she did in the first movie, which was what spawned the insightful iconic monologue, perhaps this can become a more than adequate sequel. We can only hope. That's all.